Today we come to the second class in this Introduction to the Buddha's Teaching series. And this class will focus on what is often taken to be the core or essential teachings of the Buddha. And this is the particular framework that the Buddha used called the Four Noble Truths. And in the discourses of the Buddha, when we find the Buddha giving the account of his own enlightenment experience, we see that the Buddha expressed his enlightenment as the realization or penetration of the Four Noble Truths. And so when the Buddha gave his first discourse, his first formal discourse to the five ascetics, it's called the setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. He gave that discourse in terms of the Four Noble Truths. And then we see repeatedly throughout the Buddha's teaching career, he always brings the teaching again and again back to the Four Noble Truths. And so we could say that the Four Noble Truths are taken to be the essential content or the essential framework into which the Buddha organized his teaching. And the Buddha was a very, very skillful teacher, and he knew how always to adapt the teaching precisely to the needs of the people that he was teaching. He would be able to know their deep inner needs, their psychological tendencies, their interests. And so he would use various skillful means to awaken their interests, to appeal to their inclinations. But once he got the people disposed towards his teaching, then he'll bring the teaching back to the Four Noble Truths. And when anybody achieves realization in, as we see in the suttas, in the discourses, what they realize in turn are the Four Noble Truths. So we can say that the Four Noble Truths, it's not only a teaching device, but it's the essential content of awakening or realization. Okay, so what are these Four Noble Truths? And you'll find them described. We gave out books, sort of accompanying reading for this course. So you find it described in the book by Walpola Rahula, What the Buddha Taught, and the other book called Fundamentals of Buddhism. Okay, I'm trying to use foreign words minimally in this course, but to state the first noble truth, I have to make use of this word in the Pali language, which it's a very difficult word to translate. The word is dukkha, which you'll see here. And often it's translated as suffering. And so sometimes people get the impression that Buddhism is saying that all life is suffering, or that Buddhism is pessimistic because all it does is focus on suffering. And so it seems that Buddhism is such a dark, grim, pessimistic teaching that one might wonder, how could anybody be attracted to this teaching? But then when you see people who are practicing the Buddhism really seriously, very diligently and faithfully, you would think that they would be going around with rather dark, grim expressions on their face. Like if you say good morning, they will look at you and go, oomph. But usually they have bright, smiley faces and very happy temperament. So why is that? Okay, I think part of the problem is that the word dukkha has a wide range of meanings. So the original meaning, the common usage in the Buddha's time, was in fact pain and suffering. But the Buddha took that word from common usage and then he gave it a sort of wider meaning, almost elevated it to the position of like the cornerstone of a philosophical teaching. And so the basic sense of the word dukkha, the way I explain it and understand it, is that in our life we find that things are constantly out of balance, that there's a sense of some kind of lack, deficiency, inadequacy. Things are never quite perfect, never quite fitting our expectations and desires. And so there's always this kind of gap or gulf between the way we would want things to be and the way things actually are. And that gap between them, that kind of differential between them, is what gives rise to the sense that things are out of balance, things are not quite perfect, things are not quite to our liking. And this is the sense of dukkha, like the philosophical meaning of dukkha. Okay, so the Buddha starts off with the first noble truth is the noble truth of dukkha, that there is a sense in life that there's some kind of deficiency, inadequacy, some kind of problematic nature to life, which can generate feelings that range all the ways from intense suffering and misery, even despair, all the ways to just this very delicate, very subtle sense of dissatisfaction or discontent, sort of that's always or often humming just beneath the surface of our mind. Okay, then the second noble truth is the inquiry into what is the origin of this dukkha. What is the cause of dukkha, of this whole range of feelings that extend from intense suffering to this very subtle discontent? And the answer the Buddha gives to that is craving. I'm going to come into more detailed treatment of the Four Truths as we go along. But first I just want to show the sort of structure or logic of the Four Noble Truths. So we have the problem of human existence, the problem of dukkha, then the quest to find the underlying root, the origin of dukkha, which the Buddha pinpoints as craving. Then in the third noble truth, he raises the question, is it possible to put an end to dukkha, to suffering, dissatisfaction, discontent, and so forth? And the answer he gives is that it is possible. It's possible to reach a state of perfect, unconditioned happiness and peace. And that is what we call nirvana, or in Pali, nibbana. And that is to be achieved by eliminating the cause of dukkha. That is, the elimination of craving, by reducing, overcoming, and eventually eradicating craving. The Buddha says that is possible. He says, that is what I have achieved. And then, if we're going to reach the cessation of suffering, we need a way to go about that. And that is the fourth noble truth, which is called the way to the cessation of dukkha. And here the Buddha has laid out, again, a very systematic method, which is called the Noble Eightfold Path. It's a path of practice, a path to apply to one's life that consists of 8 factors, as we'll see. And it's said that the 4 noble truths correspond to the model of a medical formula. So sometimes the Buddha is called the great physician. Just as a physician, a doctor, treats a patient and helps the patient to overcome their illness, so the Buddha looks at humankind, examines the illness of humankind, and then following the formula of medical practice, first he pinpoints what is the disease from which humankind is suffering. Then, like a doctor seeks the cause of the disease, so the Buddha seeks the cause of suffering, and then the doctor has to determine whether a cure is possible and what has to be done to achieve the cure. So that is like the third noble truth. And then the doctor will prescribe some kind of course of treatment, the remedy for the disease. And that is like the fourth noble truth. And then when we look at the four noble truths again, from another angle, we could see that they can be divided into 2 cause and effect relationships. So the first 2 noble truths, we have, you could say, the problem of human life, the problem of bondage. So here we have the diagnosis of the problem, and then the exposition, the disclosure of the cause of that problem. With the third and fourth noble truth, again, we have a cause and effect relationship. We have the effect is the cure, the cessation of dukkha, the elimination of craving, and then we have the cause or means for achieving that effect, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. And so all of this hangs together, you can see, in a very carefully structured, very precise way. Okay, now I'm going to go into somewhat more detailed treatment of each of the noble truths individually, particularly now focusing on the first and second noble truths. The other truths we'll deal with in more detail as we go along in this course. Okay, first we have the noble truth, what I call the noble truth of, here translated the noble truth of suffering, but maybe better just to use the Pali word, the noble truth of dukkha. And there are different ways of looking at this noble truth. Okay, one way in which to distinguish the different forms of dukkha I have here is between physical, psychological, and existential dukkha. And we could see this distinction if we look at the Buddha's first discourse, which I'll call up, so here the Buddha is expounding on the first noble truth. So he says, this is the noble truth of suffering. And so he says, I'll use the English word suffering. Birth is suffering, aging or old age is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. So we could say that these are, in the first instance, at one level, we could say that these are manifestations of physical suffering. So the moment of birth, getting expelled from the womb, coming out into the world. I don't have a recollection of it, but I assume that it is painful. Aging is certainly bound up with suffering. Coming to experience that more and more. Then illness is suffering, and the experience of death is suffering. But of course, also these can become causes at another level of psychological suffering. Since when one gets old and one thinks, I don't want to be old, I wish I were young again. When one falls ill, one wishes, I wished that I was healthy and strong and vigorous. And of course, we're all facing death, and there's a natural instinct to recoil from death and to wish we can go on living forever and ever, maintaining a youthful body and the full vigor of our strength and health. But inevitably, we face old age, illness, and death. Okay, but at the first level, we could say that these are types of physical or bodily suffering. Then comes three types, the three items that the Buddha enumerates that we can take to be psychological suffering. So union with what is displeasing is suffering. Not only with external things like seeing disagreeable sights, tasting disagreeable food, hearing a lot of noise, and so on. But coming together with disagreeable people is also a kind of suffering. And then separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Separation from the things that we enjoy and take delight in. And then separation from the people that we love, that we have strong affection for. And in the course of life, this separation, it's inevitable. All of our relations with all of our loved ones, at some point, have to come to an end. Even if they're the closest family members, either they will pass away while we continue to live, or we will pass away while they go on living. But that separation is inevitable. So that is a kind of dukkha. Okay, then not to get what one wants is dukkha. So here we can see maybe the way craving is operating most directly as a cause of dukkha. I want to have a new car, I can't get one. I want things always to go my way, they don't go my way. I want this, I want that, I want to be rich, I want to be famous, I want to be respected. I don't get that. I'm upset. I get angry. I get resentful. Different forms of dukkha. So these types are perhaps the most evident in our experience, in our day-to-day experience. So these, you could say, are constant forms of dukkha that we're experiencing countless times every day. But the last one, this is the subtlest, deepest, and most difficult aspect of dukkha to understand. Here the Buddha says, in brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are dukkha, or suffering. Okay, here the Buddha is using a technical term that becomes very, very prominent, very important term in his teaching. So the Buddha speaks about a living being, a sentient being, ourself. When we speak about ourselves, what actually does the word myself refer to? So usually we think I have some kind of self, some kind of ego entity behind my experience. Somebody that always remains the same, that always remains constant. But the Buddha speaks about a sentient being or a person as being constituted by 5 types of factors, 5 physical and mental factors. Yeah, so when we refer to myself or I, taking ourselves to have some kind of real substantial self there, the Buddha says that those terms are actually designating these 5 factors that constitute the living being, that constitute the person. And so what I am really is this functioning together of these 5 constituents, these are what we call the 5 aggregates. And they're the 5 aggregates subject to clinging, because these are the things that I cling to as the basis for my sense of personal identity. This is sort of the foundation on which I build my sense of personal identity. But what the Buddha says, that these 5 factors are all impermanent in that they're always arising and passing away. That they all depend upon conditions. And so there's nothing solid, substantial, and absolute in them. But they arise through the functioning of conditions. And so what we have is the bodily form, what you can see of another person, and what you feel when you get a sense of your physical presence. Then there are feelings. The word feeling here is not referring to emotions as such, but to feelings of pleasant, painful, neutral feelings. Then there are perceptions, acts by which we perceive things in our environment or things going on within ourselves. The acts by which we can identify and recognize and label and distinguish all of the aspects everything that we experience. Then in response to our perceptions, there will arise some kind of volitional activity, liking or disliking, striving to achieve some aim, formulating purposes and seeking to achieve our purposes. And then there's the fundamental awareness of all of this, which is consciousness. And all of these factors, the Buddha says, are arising, they're undergoing change at every moment. They're constantly arising and passing away. And so we seem to have some kind of constant, enduring, substantial self. But in fact, when we look at ourselves using the tool of insight, looking deeply into our body and mind, we find just this bundle of factors, all of them arising and passing, all of them undergoing constant change. And so because they're constantly undergoing change, never standing still for a moment, all dependent on conditions, they're not a basis for true security, for true lasting happiness, even though we cling to them in the hope that they will give us real happiness. So that is why the Buddha says that these 5 aggregates are dukkha. So I call this, in my outline, I call this the aspect of existential dukkha. So it's an aspect of dukkha that spreads to all of our experience. And so we have the 3 levels here we could see in the First Noble Truth. From birth to death, we could say these are the manifestations of physical suffering. The middle 3, union with what is displeasing, separation from what is pleasing, not to get what one wants, those are 3 aspects of psychological suffering or dukkha. And then the 5 aggregates subject to clinging, that is existential dukkha. Okay, another way in which the texts analyze and explain the First Noble Truth, they speak about another 3 levels of dukkha. Okay, one is what we could call ordinary suffering. So this would be bodily pain, pain that comes from illness, the ordinary aches and pains of the body. So this is obvious, clear, ordinary suffering, bodily and mental suffering. The second level is called the dukkha due to change. And this kind of dukkha applies to pleasant and enjoyable situations. Okay, so say I meet some friends that I haven't seen for a long time, and we get together, we go out together, we're enjoying ourselves, laughing, dining, joking together. So I'm in a happy situation, very pleasant situation, but then my friend has to go away, and then I feel sad. Okay, but if we look at the situation sort of with a deep penetration, we could say that even when I'm out there enjoying myself, because there's a kind of grasping of that situation, sort of a subtle clinging in the mind to that situation, hoping it will last forever, even in the midst of enjoyment, that enjoyment has a certain subtle kind of dukkha or unsatisfactoriness underlying it. Maybe you go out for a delicious meal and you get served very splendid food, and then you're eating it. But if you reflect on it, that meal is going to come to an end. And then when the meal comes to an end, then you realize that even when you were enjoying that meal, it was not really such a big deal after all. It was not giving a kind of lasting, stable kind of satisfaction. But there was even a kind of subtle, even a subtle kind of anxiety bound up with enjoying that meal. The sense that, in fact, what I found, I don't know if other people share this experience, when you go for a delicious meal, okay, you get various items on your plate, and so when you're eating one thing, it might be very delicious, but you're really thinking about the other items on the plate, right? And then while you're eating the main course, you're thinking about the dessert. And while you're eating the dessert, you're thinking about the cup of good coffee that will come after the dessert. So if you look, even in eating that delicious meal, that in that enjoyment of the food, each stage of the meal, there's some kind of something underlying that's not quite satisfying. And then when you finish the meal completely, if you're in the restaurant, then you have to pay the bill. Okay, so this is the dukkha due to change, the fact that even the most enjoyable experiences have to come to an end. And then the third level of dukkha, this is what I call the dukkha of conditioned existence. That is the dukkha that comes, that unsatisfactory nature of the five aggregates. Because everything that constitutes our existence, everything that we cling to, that we hold to as being I and mine, is just a process of factors that are arising and passing away through conditions. Okay, here I'm going to come into a controversial area. Now, in the First Noble Truth, the Buddha speaks about the suffering of birth, old age, sickness, and death, and then the other kinds of psychological suffering. But and you might think, okay, so we go through all of that one time, then it's over and done with, we die, everything finished, so nothing really that should become a big obstacle to our enjoying our life. But what the Buddha teaches is that death does not mark the end of the life process, but rather the life process, the Buddha says, has been going on through time without beginning. That through beginningless time, we ourselves have been passing through this round of rebirths. In Buddhism, we don't use the word reincarnation, which is somewhat misleading, because reincarnation implies that there is a soul, like some kind of entity that remains the same, and it drops the body and the soul goes on to another body, always remaining the same. But what the Buddha teaches is that life is a process that's always undergoing change. And the core of the life process is the stream of consciousness. And the stream of consciousness arises in any existence, arises on the basis of a physical body. And so the physical body supports, you could say this physical body is the support for the stream of consciousness. It's the engine through which the stream of consciousness operates. But the body wears out in time, or it meets with some accident or illness prematurely. And the body, when it wears out or is in some way damaged beyond repair, it can no longer support the stream of consciousness. But the stream of consciousness doesn't come to an end, but it moves on to another physical manifestation, a new existence. And that is what we call rebirth. I'm going to deal with rebirth in much more detail, not the next class, I think it's the second class from today. So I don't want to get into details about rebirth here, but just to point out that according to the First Noble Truth, the dukkha that we experience, the suffering of birth, old age, illness, and death, doesn't occur just once and then it's finished forever. But rather, each time we undergo a new existence, we encounter those same types of dukkha. We undergo birth in some form or another. We grow up, we enjoy our life. It seems that we're enjoying our life till we reach the peak of maturity. Then comes the gradual decline with all of its infirmities. Then we die. Then following death, again, the stream of consciousness moves on to a new manifestation. And the way the Buddha sees this with his deep penetrative knowledge. This has been going on without any first point. World systems arise. We come into these world systems, take different forms of life, and then world systems dissolve, and then the life forms move on to new manifestations. Okay, so this gives us a kind of broad, very broad way to look at the truth of dukkha. So, in fact, in the sutta, the Buddha says that he asked the monks, what do you think is more, the tears that the waters in the 4 great oceans, or the tears that you have shed while you've been wandering through the round of rebirths? And then the monks give the right answer. They say, the way we see it, the tears that we have shed while we've wandered through the round of rebirths is greater than the water in the 4 great oceans. Okay, so that is the first noble truth. Maybe I'll just finish all 4 noble truths, then I'll ask for questions. Okay, then we come to the second noble truth, and here, this is the truth of the origin of dukkha. And here the Buddha is looking deeply at the underlying root of all of these forms of dukkha, of suffering. And his approach is not just to treat the symptoms, not just to offer patchwork treatment of the different outer manifestations of suffering, but to look deeply to find the cause. And so the Buddha finds the cause of dukkha not in accidents, not in external circumstances, the environment, and so forth, but in the mind. It's in the human mind. So the cause, the Buddha says, is craving. And the word craving, sometimes some people translate the Pali word tanha as desire, and then they say Buddhism teaches that desire is the cause of suffering, and therefore we have to get rid of desire, but desire can be a good thing. And so that is somewhat misleading to translate the second noble truth as desire. Because according to to Buddhism, there are good desires and bad desires. So the word, the actual Pali word that's translated as craving, the Pali word is tanha, but the Sanskrit word, the same word, slightly different spelling, is trishna. And I think in the Sanskrit form, you could see the English word thirst. Because the English word thirst and the Sanskrit trishna actually have a common origin. So what is meant by this word we translate as craving is like a thirst. It's a thirst to swallow up things and absorb them into oneself as the basis for one's own identity. And the Buddha specifies, when he analyzes the nature of craving, he spells out 3 types of craving. One is the craving for sensual pleasures, pleasures through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, beautiful forms, delightful sounds, fragrant odors, delicious tastes, pleasant bodily sensations, entertaining and stimulating mental ideas to stimulate the mind. So that is the craving for sensual pleasures. But then there's a second type of craving, which is the craving for continued existence. So this is the craving that first it manifests in a clinging to the 5 aggregates, the factors of body and mind, taking them to be mine, what I am, myself. And then when this body can no longer serve as a basis for the continuing stream of experience, then this craving for existence drives the stream of consciousness into a new manifestation, into a new rebirth, a new incarnation. And so that is how, and then once that new existence occurs, it begins with conception leading to birth, then to culminating in old age, illness, and death. And so in this way, its craving is seen as that dynamic force that drives the cycle of rebirth, that drives the repetition of the process of birth, old age, and death. And then the third type of craving, it's a rather difficult one to understand, and I have to confess I've never really fully understood it myself. It's called in Pali vibhava tanha, which means the craving for annihilation, the craving for non-existence. And it might seem, you might think intuitively that this would be like the kind of craving that drives somebody to commit suicide. But in the text it's never explained in that way. But I think the way it's understood is for somebody has a kind of repulsion to existence and doesn't want to, they don't want to go on continuing in the cycle of rebirth. And so they come to the idea, they grasp hold of the idea that at death, everything comes to an end. When the body dies, everything is finished. Just one is alive, death takes place, and when death takes place, it's like turning off the machine, no more picture, shutting down the computer, nothing continuing. Okay, then I have in the outline how craving functions as a cause of dukkha. Okay, I distinguish this in two ways. One I call psychological, the other, I've coined the expression meta-psychological, beyond the psychological. Okay, so taking first the psychological aspect, how craving is a cause of dukkha, dissatisfaction. Okay, we can see this at certain stages. Okay, first, craving arises for something that I don't have. I see somebody has a nice iPhone. I don't have what's the latest iPhone? 5.0? What? They're up to 10. Somebody's making a lot of money. Okay, so, I was using iPhone 2 about 2 years ago. Okay, so I see, in the store, iPhone 10 has just come out. I remember when, I think it was the iPhone 5 came out, there was a news report showing people were lining up like the night before outside the Apple store in New York City. The line was winding around the block. People are waiting to get their, as soon as it comes out, it was to come out, the store was to open, at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., people are waiting the night before, standing up all night to get the iPhone. Okay, so I get my iPhone 10, so I'm craving, I'm dissatisfied with my iPhone 5, the 10 is available, so that dissatisfaction and the craving to get the iPhone 10. Okay, then to get the iPhone 10, I need some money, so I have to struggle, work hard to accumulate the money to buy it. Okay, I go to the store, buy the iPhone 10, now I have it, there's the delight of possession. But then comes another kind of dukkha, which is that of, we call it maybe anxious concern. So I'm always afraid that somebody might steal my iPhone. I always have to look after it, to protect it, to be sure it's functioning properly. So there's a kind of anxiety bound up with possession. Then maybe the iPhone 10 now is getting old and not functioning properly. So then comes disappointment with the object of the enjoyment. And then either the phone breaks down, or somebody say I misplace it somewhere and it's lost. So there comes the suffering of loss. Or the iPhone 12 comes out, and then I look at my iPhone 10 and I see my friends are going around with their iPhone 12, chatting about it. And they're asking, how is your iPhone? What do you have? I have an iPhone 10. And so I'm out of date. So these are some of the ways in which dukkha arises from craving, that is bound up with this craving. That is the psychological aspect. Then what I call the meta-psychological aspect is the way craving sort of attaches to these 5 aggregates and holds on to them. And then when these 5 aggregates break down at death, then craving is what drives the stream of consciousness into a new existence and starts again the round of birth and death. So that is the sort of the beyond the psychological aspect. So that is the very deep existential relationship between craving and dukkha. Okay, then the third noble truth is the cessation of dukkha, which comes through the elimination of craving. And again, this has 2 stages corresponding to the 2 functions of craving. We could say there's the psychological aspect. So when craving is eliminated, then there comes right here and now freedom from this dukkha. There's no more grasping, no more clinging, no more insatiable desire for what I don't have, but there comes a kind of peace and serenity, fulfillment, kind of inner freedom from the compulsive drives of craving. So that is the psychological aspect. Then the meta-psychological is that when craving is eliminated, then the round of birth and death comes to an end, and there comes the liberation into that ultimate state of freedom, which is nirvana. I don't want to go into details of that now, because we'll come to that more later in this course. Okay, then the 4th noble truth is the way to freedom from dukkha. And that is the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Is that the Buddha speaks about 4 tasks to be performed in regard to the 4 noble truths. And so each noble truth has its own specific task. The first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, has to be thoroughly understood. The origin, that is craving, has to be eliminated, to be abandoned. The truth of the cessation of suffering is to be experienced, to be realized, to be attained. And then the path, the Noble Eightfold Path, is to be practiced. Okay, so I think that sort of gives a broad overview of the 4 noble truths.
Well, I was born into a fairly ordinary middle-class family in Australia in 1951. Both of my parents they called themselves Anglican or Church of England, but they weren't particularly religious, and I don't really remember them ever going to church. But by the time I was about 13 or 14, I started going to church on my own accord. I just seemed to be interested in religion, and I went to, I think it was a Methodist church for some years, and I took it seriously. And then later on, a friend at school who was a very red-hot Christian sort of convinced me to go to another church which was more evangelical. But by the time I was about 17 or 18, what I learnt at least didn't make sense to me. And I had some vague or indirect influence of Buddhism a bit earlier. At one time, I can remember, a friend of my father gave him a book to read called 7 Years in Tibet. And I read this book. It's about a German man who managed to get into Tibet in the 1940s and lived there for some years. And he eventually became a tutor of the Dalai Lama, a young boy at that time. Anyway, I read this book and it really quite fascinated me. It gives quite a positive picture of Tibetan culture before the Chinese invasion. And one thing that stuck in my mind was, according to the author, that wild animals in Tibet were relatively tame simply because people didn't kill them, they didn't hunt them, and they did this because they were Buddhists. And that really intrigued me, that a religion would encourage people to be kind to animals. I liked that idea. But I didn't really think much about Buddhism, but that idea stuck in my mind. And then when I decided I'd lost interest in Christianity, I started looking around for something else. So when these Christians used to knock on the door, I'd invite them in, and my mother would say, "Oh, for God's sake, don't invite them in, we can never get rid of them." But I wanted to know what they had to say. The Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, all these people. Anyway, one day I came across a book called The Mind Unshaken by a British journalist, John Walters. And I read that and I decided I was a Buddhist straight away. Now, I didn't understand all of it, but it described Buddhism in a simple, clear way, and that impressed me a lot. And from that time onwards, I started to read as many books on Buddhism as I could get. And that's how and then after some time, I decided to call myself a Buddhist. And that's pretty much how I became a Buddhist.
Prince Siddhartha was 29. He left his kingdom just to find that sorrowful feeling deep inside. Since the foresight is seen, when the moon was way up high, he left his child, his beautiful wife. No goodbye, no nothing, not a cry. For mankind that he did. You left your princely life to seek eternal bliss. For mankind Dharma that he taught. We'll learn, we'll practice, forget we'll know. His teachings we'll follow, for we all know for mankind that it is. You left your princely life to seek eternal bliss. For mankind that you did, no sorrow, guilt or pain.
Hello and welcome. My name is Venerable Tenzin Tarpa. I'm the director and founder of SBT, the Secular Buddhist Tradition. SBT is an international online community that's dedicated to the timeless wisdom of the Buddha, sharing the Buddha's teachings in a way that's easily accessible for modern Western audiences. I'd like to take a moment and thank Global Buddha Dharma TV for creating this amazing medium for sharing the Buddha's teachings. I am absolutely thrilled to be here and to be a part of it. Before we begin, let's take a moment to appreciate our community gathered here today. Today, I feel fortunate to sit as a member of this kind community in the safety and security of like-minded friends, sharing this present moment with others dedicated to the cultivation of goodness. Today, I'm grateful for the direction and support that this community provides, a community worthy of my time and commitment, a community where my efforts have meaning, purpose, and are appreciated. Today, I'm thankful for this community of awakening, a place to gain the knowledge and skills to improve my life, a family, a home, and a sanctuary for all of us seeking refuge from the storm. And let's also remember, as conscientious practitioners, we must recognize our responsibility to the world, to strive to live skillfully while helping others to do the same, to strive to live in balance and harmony with nature and others, to strive to gain mastery over our minds and embody our true benevolent nature, to expand our hearts and minds, transcending our shared human limitations, to not intentionally harm sentient life or our planet, and to maturely accept and embrace the reality of our situation while striving to improve it. Again, welcome everyone to today's teachings. Today we're going to be examining secular Buddhism. So, although not a historical tradition, secular Buddhism is becoming a very popular and valued approach to Buddhist thought. It can be understood as an approach to the study and practice of the Buddhist teachings aimed at clarifying and demystifying them by lifting them out of their presumed religious, mystical, or cultural context. Secular Buddhism is an objective and rational approach to the Buddhist teachings, seeking to reinterpret them through fresh eyes. Commonly seen as merely non-religious, secular Buddhism actually derives the scope of its thought from new interpretations of the earliest Buddhist teachings, popularly known as the EBTs. These early teachings are largely devoid of religious, ceremonial, or ritualistic elements, possessing a more open, fluid, and adaptive style. teachings that reject religious authority, dogma, and absolutism. And for those who may ask, where exactly do secular Buddhists derive their authority? The answer is from the Buddha himself. For the Buddha, in his own words, gives his assurance that our own logic, reason, and common sense are valid and reliable tools for discerning truth for ourselves. Quote, do not go upon what has been acquired by repeatedly hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon what is in scripture, nor upon the consideration, this monk is our teacher. Rather, test ideas with your own common sense. And when you yourself know these teachings lead to benefit and happiness, adopt them. And if yourself know they lead to harm or ill, abandon them. The Buddha. Quote, just as a goldsmith would test his gold by burning, cutting, and rubbing it, so must you examine my words before accepting them, not merely out of reverence to me. The Buddha. Quote, that which is passed down by traditions may be learned well or learned badly. It may be true, it may be otherwise. Only if a spiritual life leads to the end of suffering is it of true value. The Buddha. Quote, you are your own master. You make your own future. Therefore, discipline yourself as a horse dealer training a thoroughbred. The Buddha. Quote, oneself is refuge of oneself. Who else indeed could refuge be? By good training of oneself, one gains a refuge hard to gain. The Buddha. The term secular can be defined as meaning worldly as opposed to religious. An example that I like to share is to imagine a town. And in this town, the churches, temples, synagogues, and mosques are religious institutions, whereas the schools, libraries, police, and fire department are secular institutions. In secular Buddhism, the term secular is understood twofold. First, as synonymous with non-sectarian or non-partisan or impartial view, open to the various forms of Buddhist thought, including non-Buddhist disciplines as well, like science, philosophy, psychology. Secondly, as an approach to the Buddha's teachings that de-emphasize its more religious, mystical, or cultural aspects. It's important to remember that secular Buddhism is not a set of specific beliefs or doctrines, nor is there any single group that represents it, meaning different secular Buddhist teachers and groups can hold different views depending where on the spectrum between traditional and secular they find themselves. When explaining secular Buddhism to traditional Buddhists, I find by starting to create a little common ground, explaining that most of us have all found assertions in the Buddhist scriptures that are simply too implausible to accept. Maybe it's the account of the miracles performed by the Buddha, or the Buddha having conversations with the Hindu gods. Maybe it's the story of the Buddha teaching in the heaven realms to his deceased mother, or Buddha's birth, in which he's born from his mother's side and immediately takes several steps in each direction while lotus flowers appear at each step. There are also the descriptions of the Buddha as standing 20 feet tall, with arms that can touch his knees without bending. Also, that the Buddha possesses webbed fingers and toes and has a tongue large enough to cover his entire face. Whatever the case, most Buddhists have a handful of scriptural assertions they can't rationally accept. Well, for secular Buddhists, our list may be just a little longer. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has done much work in propagating secular Buddhism. In his best-selling book, Beyond Religion, His Holiness asserts that one doesn't have to be religious or a spiritual person to engage in Buddhism, that Buddhism's science-like and psychological and philosophical approach is strongly focused on mental and emotional development, with its unique methodology founded on the cultivation of logical ethics and its many practical applications aimed at cultivating happiness and fulfillment. These can benefit anyone, regardless if you consider yourself a religious or a spiritual person. According to the Dalai Lama, it's okay to study Buddhism secularly without studying it religiously, for creating mental discipline requires no faith commitment. The Dalai Lama. Quote, religion is useful in the spiritual life, but not indispensable. The Dalai Lama. Quote, the Buddha's teachings is that you are your own master. Everything depends on you. The Dalai Lama. Some Buddhists hold reservations about secular Buddhism, seeing it as arrogant in believing that it has the authority to present a unique view that may be contrary to the views of the established traditions. Still others see secular Buddhism as heretical, believing it as an attempt to alter the Buddha's teachings to fit a modern perspective. However, in my experience, I find secular Buddhism to possess a very pure intention. And it's an approach that seeks to reinterpret the Buddha's teachings in order to uncover a clearer and deeper understanding. With that said, secular Buddhism is not opposed to traditional forms of Buddhism. Rather, it feels indebted to them and their work in preserving and propagating the teachings. For myself as a Buddhist, as a secular Buddhist teacher, I don't feel a need to defend my views or debate with others. Instead, I focus on prioritizing the aspects of the Buddha's teachings that I find most plausible, illuminating, and potentially fruitful. Those concepts that hold up to critical analysis and common sense. Those practices that have been proven to aid in the attainment of awakening. One example of this is Buddhism's assertion on rebirth. For myself, I accept the notion of rebirth as a belief, meaning I don't have firsthand knowledge of its validity. Therefore, within my work, I prioritize it accordingly, and I don't emphasize it strongly within my teachings. Alternatively, achieving bliss and happiness is not a belief for me, but rather something I've experienced firsthand in my practice. Therefore, I emphasize it throughout my teachings. The benefit and need for reinterpreting Buddhist thought becomes obvious when realizing the wealth of new knowledge and methodology available. Never before have scholars been able to analyze and compare all of the Buddhist scriptures from the various traditions side by side in their traditional languages, or contrast them against new historical and archaeological findings. Then, of course, we have new methods and findings from science, psychology, and philosophy that are exciting new tools for investigating Buddhist thought. The truth is, modern Buddhism exists as many interpretations within many traditions. This is not our shortcoming, but our strength. That we as Buddhist practitioners bravely hold the Buddhist teachings up to continuous debate and examination, accepting nothing through blind faith, while always honoring our commitment to truth wherever it may lead us. This is a sign of a healthy teaching in which it continues to adapt, grow, and spread, not merely geographically, but intellectually and experientially. Today, through skillful modern adaptation, the Buddha speaks with a fresh voice to new generations. Buddhist methodologies of meditation, mindfulness, and awakening have become mainstream concepts, crossing cultural, religious, and secular boundaries. Due to this adaptation, Buddhism now encircles the globe, something that is unprecedented in Buddhist history, a fact that can be directly attributed to the propagation of more secular presentations. Currently, secular Buddhism exists as an assortment of small groups that have arisen from different Buddhist traditions. Myself, I come from the Tibetan tradition. And although presenting unique views, the aim of secular Buddhism remains consistent with all forms of Buddhist thought, that of human flourishing leading to awakening. As far as the practices of secular Buddhism, again, different secular Buddhist teachers will have different presentations. Generally, they follow the same outline of traditional Buddhism. But it's important to keep in mind that secular Buddhism, the way it's defined within these two words of Buddhism being more of a religion and secular being non-religious, it seems to be in conflict, the two terms, to be a paradox, but it actually isn't. They represent the two ends of the spectrum of secular Buddhism. So, and on that spectrum, different teachers are at different points. Some teachers are quite traditional. I think my group, SBT, is quite traditional in our approach, our presentation of Buddhism, whereas other groups can be very secular. I think the work of the father of modern secular Buddhism, Stephen Batchelor, he presents a more strongly secular view. So according to the teacher and the group, you'll find different types of presentations. So for SBT, I've been a monk now for 15 years. I was ordained by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. I spent 10 years in monasteries in South India, getting a good education. I've traveled the world learning about Buddhism. I've studied and practiced and stayed in all of the major Buddhist countries, stayed in monasteries, practiced all the various forms of Buddhism and all the various traditions of Buddhism. And the one thing that I've noticed the most is as Buddhism moves to the West, one thing that Buddhism is moving away from is training. And so I like to think of Buddhism as far as the practice side of it. So we have the idea of the three great objectives of study, contemplation, and meditation. These are the tools we use to dig into Buddhism, to ascertain the nature of reality. But within practice and training, we have three aspects, and that's study, practice, and training. Study, as you can imagine, most people think of it as reading books and going to teachings and taking classes and studying. But study also incorporates the experiential aspect. It's studying life, it's learning from our own world, our real world experiences. It's not just book knowledge. Studying is studying ourselves, studying our experiences, studying reality, experientially and conceptually. So now that's alive and well in the West. The Westerners love to study. Then we have the idea of practice, and I think of practices as the major practices of meditation, mindfulness, uh, and contemplative practices. Those also are strong in the West. These two are very popular. Some people come to Buddhism through study. They might read a book that changes their lives, as was my case. Someone gave me a great book, and it really changed my life. Other people might sign up for secular meditation classes and mindfulness classes that have absolutely nothing to do with Buddhism. Maybe they're in stress reduction seminars and things like that, but they might enter Buddhism from that way. So these are the two primary ways that the West is engaging in Buddhism. But sadly, what they're leaving behind is training. Now, training in Buddhism is more related to our vows. Training is the commitment aspect of the teachings, right? So it begins with taking refuge. It can move on to taking bodhisattva vows, depending on your own tradition, taking lay vows, taking monastic vows. And the idea of taking vows is that you're holding a certain set of precepts of awakened behavior. And we're making this commitment to awakening. When we study and practice, most of the time we do it when we have time to do it, when it's convenient, when we feel like it. Training is different. With training, we take refuge with a teacher. We take on our first set of precepts. In my tradition, we give 10 precepts for refuge. They're the 10 virtuous acts. That can be different in different traditions. At that point, you're making a real commitment, a promise to yourself, your teacher, and the three jewels that you're going to practice Buddhism continuously. You're going to honor your precepts. There are certain practices that you follow, and there's certain recommended studies that you'll do. This is the beginning of training, and this is what is absent in a great deal of Western Buddhism. And so, and especially in secular Buddhism. As far as I know, I think SBT is the only tradition that offers training. And so, and of course, training was so important to the Buddha that there's a whole category of scripture called Vinaya, which is dedicated to training. And within it is proper behavior for monastics and also for lay. And it's so important in Buddhism that it's the first of the Tripitaka, of the three baskets, the three collections. So it's clear in Buddhism the importance of training. And so for myself with SBT, we try to really bring that back. And of course, and within that training is the threefold training. And the threefold training is training in virtue, training in understanding, and training in awareness. So training in virtue is basic goodness, right? Training, holding those vows of awakened behavior, training in being a good person, being good towards others, acting in a way that coincides with the Buddhist teachings. All right? And then we have training in understanding. Traditionally, they use the word wisdom, but it's cultivating and training in an understanding of who and what you are, how you relate to your environment and others. your relationship to reality, right? This is what we're trying to understand, the true nature of ourselves in reality. And then lastly, number three is training in awareness. Some traditionally we use the word samadhi, and many translate this differently. Some say they'll use the term concentration for this. Some say meditation. I think awareness is a nice term to use because that's really what we're doing. It's the cultivation of an awakened awareness, isn't it? Right? Which begins with a basic level of presence. Being aware of the breath, being present within the present moment. This can then lead to a deeper experience of samadhi, of stillness, of the stilling of our mind and emotions, deeper and deeper states of awareness in which we gain more and more control over our mind and emotions. We gain a mental and emotional stability. Deeper yet, we can get into experiences of emptiness. And from there, nirvana, and then full awakening. So that's the presentation that SBT follows. And you can learn more about that on our website, sbtonline.org. And we'd love to see you there. I think that that's about all the time I have for today. I hope you enjoyed and found the teachings interesting. In closing, I'd again like to thank Global Buddha Dharma TV for creating this amazing medium for sharing the Buddha's teachings. It's going to be fascinating to watch and see it grow. If you'd like to learn more about SBT or myself, please visit my website at sbtonline.org. Thank you all for attending today's teachings. It was a lot of fun for me. So let's end today's teaching with our altruistic affirmation. May all be healthy, may all be prosperous, may all be well, may all be present, free of past regret and future worry. May all abide in constant appreciation, which is the source of great joy and contentment. May all realize their true nature and the true nature of reality, which is awakening.